Mirëmbrëma edhe mirë se vini në kallëzo për një me. Gjatë javës që e hapëm ekspozitën e Reporting House, këtu në shtëpinë e gazetarëve, vendosëm me i ftu disa prej gazetarëve që qëndruan në Kosovë për 25 vjetorin e përfundimit bombardimeve, kthimit refugjatëve. Njëri prej gazetarëve kryesor, i cili ishte në Kosovë 25 vjet u kthy mas luftës, që 25 vjet s'ka qenë këtu, ishte David Loyn. David Loyn është me rëndësi sepse është gazetari i BBC-s i pari që ka fillu me arë në Kosovë edhe e ka bën intervistë historikisht tepër të rëndësishme të Kosovës. Është njëri që e ka intervistu Fehmi Lladrovcin edhe disa muaj masi që ka intervistu, Fehmi Lladrovci vritet nga forcat sërbe në Drenicë. David, welcome to Kosovo 25 years later. What does it feel like to be back?
I'm very pleased to be back. I'm thrilled to be back here. And I haven't been here since 1998. I remember at the time the ambition and hopes of Albanian culture here in Kosovo, and the Albanian resilience, the idea of a people being a Kosovan Albanian people. And seeing that 25 years later, seeing independence, autonomy, de facto, is a moving and inspiring thing.
When we had the press conference, you used the same phrase, Albanian culture. Let's go back to 98 when you came, the first report. Why do you think there was a culture? Like, what were you sensing about this culture? What do you mean by this?
Well, I'll be honest, Jetta, I was tutored by people like you. I spent a lot of time, coming here to a new place. I arrived here the day after the Prekash massacre. That was the first time I came here in March 1998 when Vaughan Smith was shot and his correspondent was going back to the UK and I was taking over as the BBC correspondent. The first story I did was to go to Skandarai to see the line of bodies of the Yashari family all wrapped up in white sheets in a very makeshift room. And I wanted to understand what had happened here. I wanted to understand the history, the context, 1389, 1989, the sense of what had happened to your generation, actually, of those, of schools and health clinics that were closed to Albanians, and the idea of the kind of culture that you've been brought up in, that you told me about and other correspondents, and I think I was rather struck by, actually the insanity of what Millosheviqit had been trying to do here. It seemed to be provoking the very response that ultimately a year later came. I think, can I just say before we go into the detail on this, it's really important to see the wider context of 1998. And people know about this, but from a Western point of view, you had in government in London and Washington two leaders, Clinton, who was ashamed by Bosnia, was ashamed by the failure of Bosnia, with a new Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who'd always been in favor of more intervention in Bosnia. She came in the year before the uprising began here. And Tony Blair elected in 1997, two governments who were in lockstep with each other on a whole series of both domestic and international issues. And Britain and America are so important in a sense of leading the Western alliance, particularly when it comes to military matters. And I think the reporting that we did during 1998, which in the 40 years I had as a foreign correspondent, was the most significant reporting that I did in terms of the way that it shifted the dial. And
you've been to Afghanistan. Where else, for us to get a sense of where else you covered?
Since 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, all of those post 9/11 conflicts, a lot of time in those countries. I've covered conflicts in South Asia, Kashmir in particular, in Sri Lanka, the Tamil conflict in Sri Lanka. But really Afghanistan as being a place that I've focused on, before and after coming to Kosovo.
So why is Kosovo so much more significant?
Because of this wider context. Because, you do reporting you report what the Taliban are doing, and the world's looking at Gaza, or the international community. It's not on their agenda. But I think in 1998 you had these leaders, particularly in London and Washington, but in other European capitals as well, who were seared by the Bosnian failure, by the way that so many civilians died in Bosnia, and that the intervention was half-hearted, too late, and they didn't want that to happen again. So in a sense, the journalism that we were doing, and I think news editors knew this, the journalism that we were doing had traction. It was, if you look at the timeline of what happened during that year, NATO foreign ministers meeting, NATO defence ministers meeting, another BBC report in the middle of that. I think we were part of a. Put it this way, I think Kosovan Albanians, playing it in the way that they did, were pushing at an open door in terms of getting significant military intervention to stop the Serbs doing what they were doing. And journalism, particularly the journalism that we did, played a significant role in that.
Interesting you say Albanians playing it the way they did. But we were playing it from 1989, when autonomy of Kosovo was taken away by Millosheviq's regime, all the way to 98 when you came. Why? How can you explain that at that time, between 89 and 98, we thought the world probably knows what we're going through, but when you came over, it shocked me that you knew nothing of our peaceful struggle.
The world didn't know all that. The Gandhian years of non-violent resistance, of waiting for the world to say, well, look, what about Kosovo too? Kosovo Albanians were effectively excluded from the room at Dayton, with the Dayton Accord that delivered the end of the end sort of the Bosnian conflict in a way. And no, I think the international community weren't watching. And I mean, look, put this crudely, unless there was going to be the things that we witnessed, the terrible oppression of people, the needless slaughter of civilians, and the braveness, the courage and ingenuity of young men and women who, and I know this, one of the things as a reporter that I've been struck by, interviewing armed irregular fighters, from Kashmir, Afghanistan, etc., is it's a really difficult thing to do. You're a teacher, a plasterer, an engineer, a medical student, and now you're carrying a weapon. And I think it was an extraordinary thing that people did. Strikingly, though, and interestingly, watching the material back again and going through all of the material that we reported on during that year, I had forgotten until this moment the significant differences between the political leadership, Ibrahim Rugova, etc., and the nascent Uchakaba KLA leadership. That there wasn't that the violent insurgency was not necessarily as widely accepted, by the political leadership, and I think it took until probably, so many people had been forced out of their homes, so many people had, lost their lives through July, August, September, until there was a more widespread acceptance of the wider population that the KLA were the answer.
Okay, because David, you have recorded a very important historical moment when you were meeting the KLA and then coming in town in this place where Rugova was normally holding his press conferences. You challenged him in one of these press conferences. I think it's such an important historical document you leave us with that I want to share with the audience, because since there's been a lot of revisionism, a lot of discomfort about the relationships and frictions between the armed resistance and peaceful resistance Kosovo, so I'd like the audience to come and see it with us. Let's watch this.
In this climate of fear, thousands of people have fled from a wide band of land near the border. baby Florentina was born in exile. Refugees now demand nothing less than independence as the price of their suffering. They were kept out of the Bosnian war, partly through a Gandhian campaign of non-violent resistance. But their leader then, Ibrahim Rugova, has been marginalised by the worsening crisis, although they still have a picture of him on the wall. The so-called president of the self-styled Republic of Kosovo has rehearsed answers to the questions of foreign journalists, but no solutions.
How will you bring the KLA into the peace process?
Dërsa për grupin që përmendni ju, po bëj ulëmtimet të shikoj kush janë ata njerëz, nëse ekzistojnë apo është lojë serbe.
But do you condemn their violence as you condemn the Serbs who provoked them?
Generator kryesor I dhunës është dhuna dhe masakrat serbe që po bëhen në Kosovë.
Well, the striking thing about that was how he, he clearly doesn't want to talk about the KLA at all, and he has this sort of, I'm not quite sure who these people are. That just showed the disjunction, and that this wasn't a combined fight. You had these secret elections that we reported in March. He won, but he was the only name on the ballot paper. So that was a fairly easy sort of North Korean style victory. But I think clearly when you see that encounter in May that we had after the interview with Fehmi Lladrovcin, there is really an exposure there of the fault lines within the leadership, and the way that over the next 2 or 3 months the KLA really became the dominant force in terms of shifting the dial before the politicians could take over again. And in fact, one of the other interviews there that I would just point out on this same subject was an interview with Veton Saroy at Kohar-Totori, who was potentially going to be a negotiator, were there going to be negotiations? And he says, look, the space for negotiations is becoming more and more limited, and inverted commas, the space for violence is becoming wider. And I think during the spring and early summer of '98, what we were witnessing, going out day after day, crossing Serb front lines and reporting what we were reporting, was this sort of gradual disintegration of the potential of a negotiated settlement that might have happened, and that so sidelining the Rugovas of this world and enfranchising the Hashim Tachis of this world.
Because out of all the material that is gathered in this now reporting house museum, yours is the only footage of this election we had, underground election. I want to share with the audience precisely this moment where your cameras catch an election happening in a garage, Albanian election happening in a garage in Prizren. Let's see it.
The churches and mosques in the ancient town of Prizren show its mixed past, but for this strange election, the Serb minority stayed at home. Polling stations were everywhere, like this one in a mosque in a massive act of rebellion against Serb authority, an underground world supported by a huge majority. Nearby, there was panic in a polling booth in a garage when the Serb police were seen. A car blocked the police approach just long enough to shut it securely. The cat-and-mouse game continued until the police lost interest and the voters who'd been trapped in the garage could be released. The concern was that the police would take the ballot boxes to invalidate the result.
We are the democratic people. We love freedom, and we can organize election in this way. And even if the police come and take our votes, we will still fight for freedom in peace.
People had a choice for their MP, but Ibrahim Rugova was the only name on the ballot for president. Whatever the limitations on this as a democratic process, the result will give the winners the moral, if not constitutional, right to negotiate on behalf of the Albanian majority here.
And I called it a cat-and-mouse game, and it was. The Serbs were a bit hopeless at trying to stop this thing happening. They knew that there were Albanians wandering around the streets, clearly, and so it was a game up to a point.
Literally, It's around the corner. It's in neighborhoods that this was happening.
But I think but it showed a reality to this parallel existence. And I think one of the distinctive things about the space that we were given by news editors, and I'll be honest, this is because Kosovo mattered in '98. That was your moment when the editor of the 10 o'clock news said, what are you doing for me tonight? We were doing 2 or 3 pieces, a week.
We have to stop there. I'm saying that to Kosovars a lot, and I want to note this moment. Why, with everything going on in the world, did editors in London do this? Because today I watched the news of the BBC, and sometimes Ukraine never makes it throughout the week. I'm baffled. There's a war going on in Europe, and often it never makes it in 9 o'clock news, in BBC News throughout the day. Why is this?
The world has a attention span for only one thing at a time, and Gaza is so clearly, such a big story at the moment. And I mean, it's very striking because I've worked a lot after the time I spent here, and after 2001, I spent a lot of time working on and writing about Afghanistan. And it was very striking in Afghanistan. They had their 18 months in the sun after 9/11, and then the Iraq War happened. And they knew, Afghans knew that they were then off the map. And again in 2021, they were there after the Taliban took over. There was lots of reporting of terrible things happening, girls' schools closed, etc. I had Afghan friends phoning me when Ukraine was invaded saying, we're off the map again. We know that. And so I'm afraid to say, Western politicians tend to respond to what happens on television. And although, and this is a wider question for media sociologists, television news, the daily news bulletin, the 10 o'clock news bulletin, is much less significant than it was. When we were reporting Kosovo, we had 12 million, 15 million people watching every night. Now it's 2, for the same bulletin, because of streaming, because of online and all the rest of it. So I think the space for the kind of really impactful reporting that breaks through nowadays has changed. But in '98, the reason why, long answer to your question, the reason why Kosovo had its place, why editors cared, was because they knew what NATO was doing. They knew that it mattered. But also because I have to say, the pictures were really compelling. And the stories were, people were very, very willing to talk to us. We got quite a lot of access to the Serb side. We were taken out in Serb helicopters. We had pictures of, what the Serbs were doing as well. I think because of what had happened in Kosovo, there was a broad literacy, about, the Serbian army killing civilians is something that people sort of knew was around in the world. So I think there was this sense of among the viewing public who were literate about the region. There was a Serbian army. There was a Serbian army doing something bad again. There was a, and you had this. Look, I have to say, principally through the courage and ingenuity of Vaughan Smith, we secured access to the KLA, who were very unwilling to talk to journalists originally. They were very suspicious of Western journalists. They didn't have a media policy. They'd emerged, as suddenly quite a successful insurgency after Prekash, which of course was a huge recruiting tool for them. And because of, as I say, because of the courage and ingenuity of Vaughan Smith, we secured access to them. And we did the Fehmi Lladrovcin interview, the first face-to-face interview in May. We'd done one interview before that off camera with an anonymous individual. It was daring of Lladrovcin to appear on camera. And he says in the interview, I realized that this might cost me my life. And of course, later in the year, he and his wife died, in fighting.
Can you explain a little bit? What did you have to go through to get that interview, the process towards it? Do you remember?
Yes, Vaughan met some significant KLA figures actually initially through a taxi driver in London, and then he followed up that contact and went to Europe. I think Switzerland was the initial. He had an initial meeting to say, look, you know, we would like to do this interview. They were wary, and they wanted to meet me. So a couple of guys came to my house in London, and who I never saw before or since. You know, but they were sort of part of the international diaspora of the KLA. We had a code word, mustesha, which when you, of course, see the interview, you understand what that code word was, because he had a magnificent moustache. That was what we were going to say at checkpoints, you know, along the way. And I have to say, one of the really strange things about reporting this conflict, and people, you know, outside should know this, we were staying in a Serb-owned hotel, the Grand, you know, inaptly named Grand Hotel, which was terrible. Freezing cold, nothing worked, food was awful, and being quite harassed by Serbs around in Pristina who knew that Western journalists were what we were doing, but it was very odd because we were crossing Serb front lines every day, Serb checkpoints, going off into Drenica, into the hills, you know, talking to people, talking to civilians, quite often being shot at by the Serbs, who would then report back. When we went back through the checkpoint in the evening, they'd say we hit the left-hand side of that white Land Rover which you've got outside here. See if we got it. And so it was a very strange conflict to cover because they knew what we were doing, and then we were feeding television pictures, because this is pre-computer days, on Serbian television feeds, you know, at the Serbian-owned TV station. And the material we were doing was, I mean, I don't know why they didn't stop us, I'll be honest. And in fact, the morning of one of the harassments, they would damage our vehicles. The morning we were going out to do this interview with Mustesha, all of the tires on all the journalists' vehicles were cut. So we got up because we were going to meet him early. Fortunately, we got up at about 3:30 in the morning, came outside, and no tires. So we woke up Gomista, and we had some spare tires. We had 2 or 3 already Land Rover tires. Fixed the car. That took an hour and a half. And then went out beyond these Serb checkpoints. And then quite quickly, out beyond maybe 5 kilometers outside Pristina, you're in Albanian-held territory. You're in the countryside. And we went up these tracks and, felt rather ridiculous when we opened the door. And, and with this password, Mustesha, and got in to do the interview. So that's how it came. What did
it feel like meeting him? He looks like a Che Guevara type person.
Yeah, he was funny. He was charismatic. Well, you know his brother. He's very similar personality. He had a sense of humor. We found again, Vaughan very skillfully as an ex-soldier, knew the lie of the land. We found a sort of scrape in the ground. I suppose it had been a quarry or something, where we could film not without being seen from anywhere. So we had time. We could take time to do the pictures we wanted to do.
It's incredible that doing the research for this exhibition, I found his picture the first time when Lladrovcin was photographed is when he was put in jail as a dissident for demanding Albanian rights as a separatist in 1985. In this exhibition, there is a picture, a photo of him in the trial. But nobody knew, even the photographer that took that photo knew who he was, because there's so many Albanians dissidents being put in jail. Now, when you met him, and when I met him, as we both did, there's something about him, I mean, you're saying he's charming, yes, but his ideology was very, very leftist. I mean, what did you think of his phraseology and everything he used, like what he thinks of Europe, and he thinks of Europe like in the beginning of 19th century Europe? Because right here we have the entire interview of his. You used a very charming few seconds, the best seconds of his interview. But right here, David, we have a 20-minute interview we did.
I must have another look at it.
And if you listen to the entire interview, David, it looks like his clock stopped a little bit when he went to jail.
But
it's
politics,
obvious.
this wasn't a very sophisticated conflict. I did several pieces about, you know, the Serbian enclaves, the churches, the monasteries, nuns with guns, as you described it. And, you know, the sense of why Milosevic and Serbian nationalists really cared about Kosovo, the Field of Blackbirds business, 1389, etc. You know, you needed to understand that context to understand the passion, the Serbian passion for this, you know, this piece of land. And the Albanian reaction was similarly, you know, simplistic and nationalist. It wasn't, you know, this wasn't a very, you know, sophisticated piece of political action. You know, there wasn't really an ideological argument, actually. You know, this wasn't a Marxist uprising in a sense, although, as you say, he wasn't a very sophisticated political thinker. But he was a brave man.
Heart on his sleeve. It was so obvious that he was willing to die. There, David, for the first time I had seen a man who smiled. The only smile we got out of him in the entire 20 minutes that I've been rewatching is when you asked him, are you willing to die? In which I was a bit embarrassed to put it exactly like you asked, are you willing to die? Well, he couldn't wait for that question.
Yeah, we pushed it a bit. We pushed it a bit for obvious reasons, because, you know, and ultimately he did die, and, you know, look, I mean, it's theatre. You know, you're always looking for and that was the news point. That was the piece we used in the interview.
Can we talk about the Belachev's mine? Because this is something that I hadn't remembered, but you haven't done this with me as a fixer. And this is a moment where I want to ask you and to say something about people you were working with, who they were, because it's rather important to give them merit, and this exhibition does.
Yes, I mean, you know, the key, we worked with a number of different local people, all of you, tremendous personal, you know, bravery and skill and courage, really, but also passion. I was always very struck by the, you know, I thought if you weren't going to work for the BBC, you'd probably join the KLA. You know, that you saw, I think rightly, I think you understood that was, you spoke English, you were going to help the BBC as part of a war aim. I think, you know, in a sense, there was a sort of nationalist Albanian sense in what you thought you were doing.
As you say, we seem to have been people with agenda. I mean, we were 19, yes. 20, yes. But we were obviously helping you so you can help Kosovo.
Yeah, I was an impartial BBC journalist reporting a story. The story that I saw was a people with a genuine grievance, which had been stoked up since 1989. So I think there was so we were reporting fairly what was going on.
I know,
and then
but can you speak a little bit about?
Yeah, no, I'm coming to it. And
okay.
As the uprising increased, you know, the violence increased during the summer, we'd done quite a lot of the context. I mean, apart from you, the person we worked most closely with was Fehmi Lladrovcin, who's now a very senior correspondent with Associated Press, editor with Associated Press. And Fish was, you know, our other main go-to person, but there were others as well. Visar, Belma.
Visar Kryziu, yeah. Belma Bajrami.
Absolutely.
These were key people. And let's not forget Vladimir Marjanovic.
But I was going to say, so we would always ensure, and quite often we'd go out with two. We'd have Vladimir Marjanovic, who is a very distinguished Serbian interpreter at quite a high level. I mean, he used to interpret for Milosevic in international meetings, etc. He was I think he always, he'd worked a lot with Martin Bell in Bosnia. He was experienced working with the BBC. French was his main language. He was, I think he was always slumming it a bit when he was speaking English, but I was fond of him, and he worked hard, hard and quite bravely for us at managing, the things that we encountered at checkpoints. So we would tend to keep you, if you remember, in the back of the white Land Rover, under a blanket when we were coming up to a Serb checkpoint, and then we put Vladimir in the back and not use his name. When we were in Drenica, talking to the KLA. But I remember there was one day when, rather drunken Serbian checkpoint, they were kind of got us all out of the vehicle and giving us a hard time. And one of them took a hand grenade out of his tunic and put it inside my shirt, basically, sort of, and with a kind of, what are you going to do about that, BBC, and Vladimir managed this very elegantly. He waited a couple of minutes, then he sort of picked it out and handed it back to the man as if he was giving him a sort of gift. It was kind of, and we drove on. But I think there were, having that breadth of understanding, when we went off to the Serbian monasteries, when we were talking to the Serbs, we had an ability to do it. And there was, you were all working for, and I think you knew that, for an objective and impartial international news organization, but you all had your own, it was your country. And I salute your personal courage and skill in what you did at that time.
Can we talk about the moment when you discovered the Ohri massacre? It was 2 journalists that I have found in my research, it may have been more, who have covered this. It was Julius Strauss in newspapers of UK, and it was you who revealed the Ohri massacre to the world.
Yeah, before we get on to Ohri, in chronology, I think the Blood Rock incident and the movement of people out of Drenica in August was, if you look back over all of the incidents that led to the NATO intervention, clearly Prekash kicked off the whole thing. But there wasn't really much. We were doing lots of reporting, but in terms of changing the dial, in terms of moving things internationally. But when in August, there was a really mass movement of Serbian tanks, their first use of tanks that we saw, helicopter gunships into Drenica. That's when I think the world went, whoa, this is different. That was a sort of different scale, and we went to a place called Blood Rock, and actually that was the report that won a big British International Award for what it's worth. The Royal Television Society Award, and it won it because we were speaking to people who just left their homes that day. They were as it were freshly, they weren't camping in the hills. They were cowering in the forest, and there were tank shells crashing in the woods all around us. They were firing just blindly up at this hillside, and I think that was. It was the emotion of those people and the shock of seeing, tanks being used against civilians in this way. That was I think it was in terms of, television reporting, people responded to it in Britain. Well, that's changed. Something has changed. And then it was about a month later. The fighting got worse and worse during August and September. The number of people who were leaving their homes, and Paddy Ashdown came to Kosovo, and he'd had real trouble being given access to come in, and of course he had no transport. He'd come before, I think once, so he came out on the road with us. So, and you know who he is, former Balkan High Representative, the leader of a major political party in Britain. And he was very invested in Kosovo because of what he'd done in Bosnia. He knew, what the Serbs could do, what how conflict would change things in this region. So we had a very strong piece of reporting of Paddy on a hillside looking at these, Serbs destroying villages, through binoculars and saying, this is a war crime. The people responsible for this, the politicians who ordered this are, could be indicted for war crimes. And he was going to go and meet Milosevic. So he went to Belgrade with this information, as it were, under his belt. And when he meets Milosevic, he speaks to him directly and says, I told him that if he were to continue with these operations, he would make himself indictable for war crimes. He was personally responsible for further continuation. And when we went up to Belgrade, there'd been this news of a massacre. There'd been a news of another killing. And Vaughan went to investigate. So I went up to Belgrade with another cameraman and editor. And Vaughan stayed behind. And he sent those pictures of the Obria massacre, up to Belgrade. So we had this amazingly strong report with Paddy Ashdown in the hills, a handshake with Milosevic, and this new. So we started the piece with this new massacre. Babies, Wellington boots, next to a grave that was that long. It was again. I mean, all these pictures of the killings that went on, and this was off the back of weeks of this kind of reporting. I mean, we'd been in the hills every day, and we would encounter another family. With I remember one. You've got the pictures of this of a horse and cart that had been leaving a home, and they'd obviously been hit by artillery or something like that, and the horse had careered down a ravine and died, and the men who were there said that the women and children's bodies were taken away by Serbs who came in order to sort of disguise what had happened. And we arrived, and there were these weeping men dealing with this terrible carnage of this horse and cart in a ditch and dead men, and and there was report after report like that. And I remember Serbs, presumably Serbs, alleged, but presumably who had burnt supplies of grain in villages. So, making it really impossible for people to remain. They couldn't eat the grain that they had, and they couldn't plant anything for the harvest next year because the grain supply was being burnt. Animals that were killed, dead cows. I mean, it was day after day of that kind of activity leading up to the Obria events in September. And I think, I know that the Obria massacre report played a role in NATO's intervention, because it was just before there was going to be a NATO foreign ministers meeting in the United States. Robin Cook went to the US, showed Madeleine Albright. He took a VHS copy of our report, put it in the machine, played it to Madeleine Albright, and both of them agreed this has to stop. Robin Cook told me that. So there was of all the reporting that we did, I know that the Obria massacre made a difference. And then you actually, from September, you had an unstoppable momentum towards NATO bombing, unless the Serbs had changed what they were doing over the winter, and as we saw, they didn't. But one of the other things that I would point to, and again, looking back over the reporting now, 25 years later, and I'd forgotten this, but looking back over it now, was the strong sense during the months before the NATO intervention that they didn't want to do it to encourage a military insurgency. That they were always trying to moderate what they were doing during '98, so as not to, as it were, congratulate the KLA. So NATO was not working in lockstep with the KLA, although we saw, and Dick Holbrooke, the American envoy, only met the KLA, because he went in that vehicle. He went in our armored vehicle with Vaughan off to meet them. So there was clearly the BBC equipment, as it were, was playing a role in those interventions.
Are you sure Holbrooke
yes.
went into that car that is now
Yes.
a relic and is here
Well,
exhibited?
ask Vaughan.
He went with Vaughan to see Holbrooke?
To see the KLA.
The KLA?
Yes. He met them in a house in the middle of nowhere.
I find this extraordinary because US diplomats do not go in other cars but their own.
Yes.
It's a certain protocol.
You asked Vaughan. I mean, that was the story that I heard. I wasn't here that day.
Holbrooke was unusual. He was a bit of a maverick diplomat. He would go beyond the protocol.
You have to check that. You have to check that information.
I'll check that.
But
it might be.
Despite that meeting, that wasn't an endorsement of the KLA. The international community, and as you say, Holbrooke flew, on his own. There was a very strong sense, and you see it in report after report of mine during the summer and autumn of '98, that if there was going to be a NATO intervention, it wasn't going to be on the side of an armed insurgency, which I think is of interest.
It's interesting you say that wasn't an endorsement, but since in our post-war history, that picture of Holbrooke, which the BBC filmed, Holbrooke with the KLA, the guy is called, his KLA name was Lumi, with the Kalashnikov, it became
a symbol.
It became a symbol of endorsement.
Yes, of course.
Whether he liked it or not.
Of course, and in 1999, I think that narrative changed because the mass movement of people into Albania and Macedonia in '99, even before the NATO bombing, became an unstoppable momentum towards conflict. And of course, the only people that was going to help were the KLA. So of course they emerged as initially as the post-war victors of what had happened.
I would like us both to see this incredible report you did, and I'm not the one saying it. You won the Royal Television Society Award, the highest body in UK that awards journalists, and it's called the Blood Rock. And then I want to talk about it. Let's see it.
Pausing briefly at an outcrop they call Blood Rock, Nazmi Mailoku weeps for his parents, who said they were too old to move when the village was shelled at dawn. He doesn't know what's happened to them. He says the world does not care, nobody cares. After tanks and heavy machine guns pounded away all day, troops moved in like ants across the landscape, some columns marching for protection behind armoured vehicles. The Kosovo Liberation Army, mostly lightly armed farmers, could do little against this onslaught but help the refugees. More than 250,000 people of Albanian origin have lost their homes across Kosovo since the Serb offensive began in the summer. But this is the first sustained assault into the wooded hillsides of Drenica, the region where the KLA began. He says Drenica is burning on all sides. Savagely, systematically, but almost casually, the Serbs have entered the last stronghold of their opponents, the KLA, destroying every village and hamlet along the way. And all around, the woods are full of people who are too frightened to move, shaken by every falling shell. A Serbian police spokesman has talked in a statement of measures being taken to protect the civilian population and avoid civilian casualties. But it is a simple fact that this morning these people were in their homes. Tonight those homes have been burnt down by Serbian soldiers and police. 6 months after President Millosheviqit was given a so-called final warning by the West. David Loyn, BBC News, Kosovo.
So we have this report, David, because Frontline Television News has saved all the archives of the BBC that Vaughan filmed, not as BBC staff, but as a freelance cameraman. He has the rights to these reports as well as the BBC. But when we both sat down now in that room to watch this report, you broke down.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it was very emotional. I think I was taken back to. I think it was a very difficult year, actually, as a reporter. You know, none of us goes to war unchanged, and I think day after day, I haven't got PTSD, but reactions, normal, natural human reaction to fear of your own life, and actually sympathizing with the loss that others are facing. I mean, we saw people that day in their most, and I think one of the reasons why that report really touched a nerve and did win this award, etc. We saw people in the extreme of their lives. They had just been pushed out of their homes. They'd lost their homes. And I think you're right. I mean, looking back at that report 25 years later, I found a very emotional experience. I was taken back to something that was quite, that was difficult. And I was never one of those journalists who said, "Look at me, look at how much I'm affected by this." That's not interesting. I'm not, I'm interested in the audience's reaction. I'm interested in putting weeping men on television, actually, if you like, which is what we did that day.
Can I stop you there? Because we started talking about Albanian culture, and that's what I find extraordinary. You got a weeping Albanian man. A weeping Albanian man is not something I found in hours and hours of footage. I had to look to bring this exhibition together. You got an extremely weeping Albanian man, and in our culture, men do not cry. Men do not cry.
Yeah, real men don't cry. Yeah.
Start with a weeping Albanian man.
Yeah. We encountered quite a lot of weeping men that summer. The incident I described with the horse in the ravine, all the men are crying when they're carrying the bodies. Amazing sort of access, visceral human access. And I think it does affect one as an individual. I'm not an automaton, and I always wanted to be, as a reporter, and I think this is really important. And some journalists wear their hearts on their sleeve more, and try and empathize, and so of course you have to be a human being in that situation, but you're not there to emote. You're there to try and tell the story and put a little bit of, people say, a little bit of ice in your soul in order to, on the day, in order to bring this material back.
I want to test your memory now on a lighter note. If you remember a particular moment which was never broadcast, because I didn't see those pictures in your broadcast, but certainly they are very funny pictures of Paddy Ashdown trying to save a cow from a river in a village. The highest British official that had visited Kosovo in '98 and '99 was Paddy Ashdown.
Yeah.
Here's a member of parliament putting his trousers up, his sleeves up. He goes into the river. And I want the audience to watch it and then comment it together.
I have to say, I'd forgotten we filmed that. It was very funny because I think our Serbian and Albanian escorts, there was quite a group of people. There was quite a number of British journalists. And our Serbian and Albanian escorts thought we were mad. But no, so there was this, it was a calf, it was only a small cow, had fallen down into this ravine.
But what is this about a British guy that comes in a village and thinks he can save our cow from a river while other Albanian villagers are watching and they don't know what to do?
No, he was a former. I mean, when he was in the armed forces, he was in the special boat squadron, the marine equivalent of the SAS.
He wasn't a farmer?
He wasn't a farmer, did you say?
He was never a farmer?
No, I don't think he was.
Yeah.
But he was a go-to kind of guy. He wanted to save the calf.
This is what British military does. This saves a cow.
It's a decent thing to do. But the funny thing was, he was with the slightly portly military attaché from the Belgrade embassy. and I think who rather felt he had to help, but clearly also rather felt, as you did, that this, that there were other things, other priorities that day, So they went down into the ravine and into this ditch, I suppose, was it? It was about 10.
I must say, David,
4 or 5 meters down, and he tied a rope round it, and all the journalists were asked to pull on the rope to try and get this thing out. I think we got it up.
I had completely forgotten about this.
It's quite funny.
When I saw the pictures, I couldn't recall this had happened.
No.
I think I stayed away in the car. I was so embarrassed. I didn't know what to do with a cow. I had never seen a cow in the water, or never seen a cow that close, to be honest with you.
Yeah, you were thinking of veal. You weren't thinking of this live calf.
Yes. I mean, what I want to say is that he did something many of us would feel embarrassed to do. I've got to be honest, I wouldn't save a cow.
Well, there you are. He did.
That aside, what did Paddy Ashdown's visit do for Kosovo?
I think there were 2 visits, actually, and I think when he was saving the calf was not when he came out to Obria. I think Paddy Ashdown, because he was so keen for Bosnia not to happen again. If you listen to what Paddy Ashdown says in the clip that we used in the Obria massacre report, when he's looking through binoculars at the hills, he says very specifically, this is a war crime. What we're seeing is a war crime. The people responsible for this, should be indicted. And of course, he was meaning Milosevic, and he was going on to meet Milosevic the following day. So the timing of it, I think he was, he's a politician. He was using that incident to do exactly what he wanted to do, which he succeeded in doing, which is to put pressure on Milosevic. And if Milosevic didn't change his mind, then what that meant, and he knew that, was that only a week later, NATO took the first really significant decision at the beginning of October '98, after that report, that they would move towards military intervention. You,
David, are talking about my culture, Albanian culture, but I want to throw a mirror back at you and ask you, what is it about the British culture? Because today, in 2023 and 4, we have Alicia Kearns, who's the head of the UK Foreign Policy Committee in the Parliament. She was the only one who warned the world that there's going to be an attack and Serbs are arming, the sort of groups of the north are arming. And a few months after she warned that there is weapons being carried by ambulance from one place to another, very controversial statement she made. A few months later, there was a Banjska attack. 30 armed men came to a monastery in the north of Kosovo and tried to organize an attack, actually, that ended with one killed police officer. It's a terrorist attack. When I go through the archive, I see Paddy Ashdown raising a voice at a time where few diplomats came here. Now Alicia Kearns does it. What is it about the British culture?
She's very good. Alicia Kearns, chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, very engaged in a number of issues internationally. What is it about Britain? We have a long history of involvement with the world as a nation, for good or ill, the largest empire the world's ever seen, etc. And I think there is the legacy of that is as a permanent member of the Security Council since 1945. Britain punches above its weight internationally, and I think British politicians and foreign officials see themselves as being representatives of a nation that has shown quite often in the last 25 years during the liberal intervention military period, for good or ill, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. We were right to be there. So I think there's a nature in Britain's role in the world which is different from the recent history of other large European nations. Germany, France similarly has an internationalist perspective. which plays more in the Middle East and more in Africa than it does in the Balkans.
We were both in a panel with Emir Sugalic, the Bosnian survivor of the Srebrenica massacre, and while talking to him, he told me the difference. I asked him, why do you think the internationals were so late to respond to Srebrenica, and they did it so fast in Kosovo? He gave me an interesting answer, which I want to test with you. He said, because our internationals were without integrity. They didn't care. And you had better, more people with moral compass looking at Kosovo and with more integrity, people who wanted to build careers as being known for saving people.
Yes.
So how is that?
Well, I think the answer is in the question. It was because of the failure after Srebrenica, it was because of the failure of Srebrenica itself that the politicians who were there after Madeleine Albright in particular, 96, when she was appointed as Clinton's Secretary of State, the new Labour government in 1997, it was because of what had happened in Bosnia that they weren't going to let it happen again. So they were attentive to it. They were watching for when it happened. Well, there's one thing I'd really like to say, because we talked a lot about the context before the war. I think Kosovo ought to know where it fits internationally in the post-war reconstruction. And I know that it wasn't done very well here. And actually, I remember a phrase that you used in those years after, when the UN was very involved, in a very big way, and you had a lot of officials from, I think you had a Ghanaian running your education system. I'm sure he was outstanding. But the phrase you used was that we had second-rate administrators from third world countries. Which was very telling and completely told the story. And I think the international community didn't learn the lesson they should have learned from Kosovo, which is that post-war intervention, post-war reconstruction, post-war nation building after a military intervention is a really hard thing to do. And I think had that lesson been learnt in Afghanistan in 2001, which was the next significant international intervention. Again, Britain and America at the front line in military terms. Had that lesson been learnt, then I think the history of Afghanistan would have been very different. And I've written a history of the intervention in Afghanistan, and there's a very interesting parallel with Kosovo, direct parallel that the Americans drew, that because they built bond steel, the permanent base that they have here in Kosovo, there was a sense that in the Bush administration in 2000, who wasn't an interventionist, when he came in, the people around him didn't want to make the same mistakes that they thought they'd made in Kosovo. And I interviewed General Dan McNeill, who was the first US general as a 3-star back in 2001, and then later, 6 years later, was the 4-star commander of the by then much larger international forces. But in 2001, he was told explicitly in these terms, no more bond steals. We're not building a permanent base in Afghanistan. You're going to be intense. You're going to be out by the end of the summer. Now, of course, it was harder to do, and they realized that they needed more troops, and within 8 years they had 150,000 international troops. Had they learnt the lesson in Kosovo, the right lesson, which is that you need security, you need proper security at the beginning, and you need better management, better governance, rather than allowing corruption, which of course happened here and happened much worse in Afghanistan after the intervention in 2001. But the lesson that they learnt was not to keep there in the long term, no more bond steals. So I think there was the wrong lesson that was learned from Kosovo.
Wrong lesson, but in Kosovo, wouldn't you say it worked? That they kept a long base, they're still there, not with as many troops, just the right amount.
Yes.
Wouldn't you say this is a good example
Yes.
of what an intervention should be and
in
how
military
long should it
in
stay?
military terms? Yes. I think some of the other nation building bits
Yes.
were not as well done right at the beginning, and it was quite hard. It's always quite hard to restore a kind of a political order without, being extremely interventionist, as for example, the international community was in Germany in 1945. There are some advantages in the way you do it there, in being very directional as to how you manage the political economy.
In the end of our interview, I want to talk a little bit about the other activities, the other hats you hold, because you're beyond a veteran BBC correspondent. You are advisor in the Vienna process in Afghanistan. You are member of Frontline Club in London helping independent journalism. Mostly, you are advisor in the Imperial War Museum, which is the biggest museum in UK that tells the story about Britain in wars everywhere. Can you tell us about how is Britain remembering post-Second World War conflicts, former Yugoslav conflicts? What is Britain doing to collect and tell the story of where its peacekeeper kind of missions go?
It's a very active program. And the Imperial War Museum, look, the clue's in the name. It started after the First World War, very much at the peak of empire and a sense of Britain's role in the world being unquestioned as being a great nation, etc. And of course that's changed in the last 50, 70 years, and right across the British academic and intellectual sector, but particularly in museums, there's been a lot of language about decolonizing the agenda and decolonizing museums. And you've got a museum called the Imperial War Museum, which of course has faces obvious challenges. They've done it by retelling the First World War very much from below, rather than being just about the military campaigns, the way recruitment happened, the kind of social makeup of Britain in the beginning of the 20th century, 1913, 1914, and by there's a big new Holocaust exhibition by looking at the Second World War in it not through necessarily the frame of British soldiers, but there has been an active collection of material from troops involved in conflicts in I don't know precisely what they've got from K4, but they'll have material, and it has been reflected in an exhibition about liberal interventionism in
because we're in the beginning of making such a museum here, and I'm thinking a lot and dilemming with myself about how does a war museum look? What should we have? What we have? What is the advice from a small country that cannot make the scale of Imperial War Museum? What's advice that you can give to us now that with the hat of an advisor that you are to this museum?
Well, so there's one problem, which is provenance. They have had a lot of material given to them by soldiers who've come back from Iraq or Afghanistan, which they can't take in because they don't know what, it's been taken from a village. We're sitting next to the notebook of the Yashari children. Who owns that? Have the surviving members of the family given rights to it? So, of course, you'll ask those questions, but things taken off the battlefield, have a provenance question, which, museums are grappling with provenance throughout a whole series of things. A lot of our museums are full of imperial loot. Things taken, the so-called Benin bronzes, famously taken from what's now Nigeria in fighting in the late 19th century, and the people who currently rule that place want them back, and the French are giving back goods. So different countries are managing these imperial legacy in different ways. So now, of course, you don't face those challenges, but you might face provenance challenges with collecting things. But I would say you have the capacity to do absolutely as well as the Imperial War Museum in putting together exhibitions. The very best exhibitions recently have been, there was a wonderful exhibition in the Imperial War Museum North in Manchester on Yemen. And they had about less than a dozen items, which were quite, one was a sandal, one was a a cornflakes packet, and which told its own story. And so you told the story of the Yemen war, not necessarily through a huge collection of amazing military material, weapons, etc., which is traditionally what they might have done, but through these domestic items and the stories of the people who had owned them and where they'd come from. And if you have those stories, I mean, this notebook is a compelling artifact. It's probably one of the best things you've got, and really, conserving that properly and telling its story, says a huge amount about what happened in Prekash in March in 1998. I've been very struck on this visit by the way that Kosovo is remembering. I went to Prekash. I find that huge new memorial very moving. Clearly, the damaged buildings need to be conserved more. I was very struck by the coachloads of school children coming to visit the memorial, and what they were told, that this is about the resilience of Albanian culture. This is about our people. It's not about victims. It's about the nature of Albanian resilience.
I'm glad that's what you think now, but let me remind you the words you said at a time when you were filing reports about this whole situation. You said this was a slow death of a nation having its heart cut out.
Yes, but
why did it feel like?
But during the summer, because during the summer and autumn, the Albanians were absolutely they were fleeing from their homes. They were living in terrible squalor. All of the hopes of the secret parallel world, had gone. I mean, how could you run clinics in that sort of an environment? Babies were being born in the woods. I mean, it was that was the sense, and there was a sense. There was a sort of mad hope that Serbs might move into these abandoned villages. There was the replacement, displacement of peoples is not out of the question. If there hadn't been, military intervention in 1999. I described it in one report, and looking back over it, as not ethnic cleansing, but ethnic disintegration. This sense of something that was very deliberately being dismantled, which was the ownership of these hills by the people who'd lived there for generations.
What most impresses me about your report, and that's why we've given it the key place in the BBC room. You have a central place, not because you won an award, but the level of detail which went into your report, the level of social detail, and that's why I want to end with this report, not because it's best dramatic pictures, but you talked about our children having polio. Now, this level of detail, I cannot remember that we ever talked about in our families about polio. I don't think we had so much health awareness at the time. We didn't know there was polio amongst our community.
Yeah.
You came from the outside and you spoke about our kids having polio. I think this is like social history, not just ethnic and war history. I find this so important for us to go back to understanding that we had to battle with polio being not treated.
Yeah.
So let's watch it.
Just 1 day old, and she hasn't even got a name yet. The youngest citizen of Kosovo, a province of Serbia, or an independent country, depending on who you talk to here. There are more babies on the way in a clinic the size of a private house, an average of 10 births every day in this room, while in another, medical students crowd around for a lesson. Their hopes are high, their facilities terrible in a land with the worst tuberculosis in Europe, where polio has just made a comeback, and where you're 5 times more likely to die than in a neighbouring Serb hospital. Downstairs, hundreds of patients arrive in a constant stream for medicine donated from abroad. The health workers get paid nothing.
We survive like all people around. We can go on, but we must go on because people need us. They want our help, so how long as we are, we will help our people.
Public health is collapsing, with clean water available for only half of the population. The shadow world of Kosovo's Albanian majority began in 1989 with a dispute over language. But the Albanian doctors who were sacked en masse by the Serbs deny that they're putting nationalist principles over the rights of their patients. They say they didn't have a choice, since Serbia is imposing apartheid on them.
We were forcefully and arbitrarily replaced from our positions. So we haven't left our patients. We are asking to have our position back. We believe that the Serbian apartheid, it's crime against humanity.
This is a health service in crisis, kept going only with international aid and the goodwill of medical staff. After so many years like this, it's now close to breaking point. Security is worsening ahead of Sunday's elections for the Kosovo Albanians' underground parliament. 72-year-old Uk Nikai was shot when he came out onto his balcony. Someone must have been trying to set him against neighbouring Serbs, since their houses were hit at the same time. The unknown gunmen standing in the trees are throwing a match into a dry tinderbox. In the capital, Pristina, demonstrations have been held all week, including a symbolic attempt by women to take bread to the families in the region still under a police blockade since the bloodshed earlier this month. There was nothing symbolic about the Serb police line which turned them back. David Loyn, BBC News, Kosovo.
I mean, the thing that struck me then and now was the bravery of these people. You know, doctors who'd been fired several years before, working for nothing, working with, you know, with I don't know what the Red Cross was giving them and all the rest of it. The reason why I mentioned polio is that it's such a symbol of social failure. The only places that polio now exists in the world, because it's so easy to just have mass vaccinations and get rid of, the only places where it exists are northern Nigeria, the Pakistan frontier and Afghanistan. Muslim fundamentalist areas where there's opposition to mass vaccination. And it's increasing in Afghanistan again now under the Taliban. It's such a symbol of social breakdown. And I think, you know, perhaps I should have said that more strongly in the report. That's what this means. Because it's such a shock. It just doesn't exist in, you know, more than a tiny handful of places in the planet. And when it emerges, something has really gone wrong with healthcare.
25 years later, David, it's not just me remembering your reports. You've been invited to Kosovo by the state, going to state events as an honorable guest that contributed to Kosovo. You got a merit from the mayor. What does it feel like? But do you get this, not just what does it feel like, but do you get this from other countries? Maybe it's normal for correspondents who have contributed in certain war. You've been more to Afghanistan than here. Do you get it there?
What can I say? I'm very honoured, and I thank you for, you know, the invitation and the invitation to tell my part in your story, which is how I see it. It's your story. I mean, it's not mine. I was always able to return, you know, to my family, and I remember the Ratchak massacre rather well, because it was a Saturday morning, and I was in the playground with my children, and something had happened. You know, I got a call from the news desk. You know, there's been another thing in Afghanistan, and I called up Fishnik Brushy, and I said, what do you know? What do you know about this? Do you know? There's a report that maybe there might be 20 dead, and he said to me, I'm just counting the dead now. He was mobile phones. He was in Ratchak in this ditch full of people. You know, 25, 26, 27. It turned out to be about 40 in the end. So the disjunction of that, of pushing my son on the swing in the playground, and that was a striking thing. It was a really interesting year of my life, actually, and I think I said, but I could say it again. You know, these were the most significant television reports that I did, partly because of the nature of the access that we had, because of Vaughan's courage, your courage, you know, the people we were working with, but partly because of this political context that we were operating in, that the international community was watching what was happening in Kosovo in 1998 because of what had happened in Rwanda and Bosnia before, and Croatia, and the sense of not wanting this to happen again. And that was very strong among reporters as well. A lot of us, I didn't spend that much time in Bosnia. I was based in South Asia then, but I did some reporting there. And I knew the horrors of that conflict, of course, because it had been very widely covered. I covered some aspects of Srebrenica from London. These terrible pictures coming in of these men and boys being taken away. Because I happened to be in London in '95 when it happened. It was a unique. The reporting I did here in '98 was a unique part of my life, actually. And I'm very pleased to be back.
I'm so happy you're here. It's also due to your bravery. We have all these reports and incredible pictures, which you gave a lot of good words to, really good writing in your, a huge, that takes out this humanity and emotion that was in our conflict. I think it was the best writing from a lot of the BBC reports I had to see. So thank you for that. And thank you for having such a fit, retired mind. You're retired now and you're back talking about us.
It doesn't sound like retirement, certainly if you go through the things that I'm doing in terms of trying to build a coherent opposition in Afghanistan, writing books, etc.
Yes.
But I'm very honored to be here.
Thank you. Ishte ky David Loyn, gazetari I cili qysh në 98 ishte prej të parëve që erdhë me mbulu luftën në Kosovë. Unë e njoftova 98-ën, po tash merr mirë që po ta rastin me nda punën e tij që e njoh prej atëhershit, edhe me juve, për të cilën mendoj që duhet me ditë krejt Kosova. Kaq kishim për sonte, natën e mirë.